just to try to stay on top of their illnesses. Everybody seems to have something that they haven't been able to accomplish. And they're buying, trying this and that. And he said, they said, 60% is about right. 60% of people are in the first act of illness, and they're really not being seen by physicians. They're not being taken care of properly. We'll come back to Act 1 again, as I said earlier. Act 2, he said, has roughly 30% of sick people in it. These are medium sick people who are being taken care of by primary care physicians, and there's a fine relationship usually between the patients and the doctors, and they trust each other, and this is where really good medicine is practiced in most cases. At least, he said, this is where we ought to be giving much more attention to it. But he said, what I'm really getting around to is Act 3. Act 3 has only 10% of sick people in it. But this is where all the excitement is. This is where all the hoopla is. This is where all the TV shows are. And this is where, he said, well, this is kind of interesting, because we then got into this discussion, which was, I said, well, what percentage of doctors are in Act 1? And the answer was about 1% of doctors are in Act 1. How many doctors are in Act 2? And the answer was about 29%. They said 30%, but with the 1% gone, that leaves 30%. 29. Then we come over to Act 3, and the answer here was that 70% of the doctors, is that right? 70 and 30, yeah. 70% of the doctors are working in Act 3. These are specialists and super specialists. 70% of doctors are taking care of 10% of the sick people. In the audience was the dean of a medical school, and he said, I've got to show you where the medical school is on this chart. And he drew another line here. He said, the medical school is right here in this little section here. This is where we train young people to become physicians. Med school. But he said the patients we see in our teaching and research hospitals are really, they really make up only 1/10 of 1% of sick people on the average day of hospital care. In other words, the medical students are being taught essentially by super specialists and specialists, and they're seeing only the very, very sick people. And he said, this is what our real problem is today. And he said, and this was about 10 years ago, this is what we've got to change. And he said, what we're doing at our medical school is we're sending our medical students not into the wards of the teaching and research hospital, but out into the community hospitals where they will be able to work with family doctors, where they will be able to see people who are just sick enough that they can be handled by doctors and don't always have to have all of the special things that are available in a teaching and research hospital. Because this is the group of doctors that ought to be increasing in America. As long as we teach them here, and they're taught only by super specialists, they get the idea that that's real medicine, and this kind of medicine is just kind of second-class medicine. Well, the good news is that this has been happening now over the last 10 years, that more and more medical schools are sending their students during the first 4 years, not during residencies, but during their first 4 years, out to community hospitals and to neighborhood clinics, where they're working with doctors and patients and families and get to see how exciting that kind of medical care can be. Well, then we began talking together about what would be the ideal number of doctors in each of these three categories. And they immediately said, this 70% should be changed to about 30%. Because that's all you need, is 30% taking care of 10% of the sick people. There are too many surgeons now, too many this and too many that. And the next number they came up with was that this ought to be changed to about 65%. If 65% of doctors went into primary care, this would keep people from getting this sick and would be in the field, in a sense, of preventive medicine. Well, this kind of pleased me because this gave me then 4% more for the first act, which I'm so concerned about. And their reply was, forget it. Doctors did not become doctors in order to take care of little bit sick people. They came into medicine because they wanted to really help their fellow humans who were very sick. And some of them say that they know that one good grandmother is worth 2 pediatricians. And we know that a lot can be done without super training. But if this is to happen, we will find ourselves in, I think, a pretty ideal situation. The good news also is that our graduates now, over the last 10 years, have been gradually moving away from the 70% toward the 65%. But it isn't there at all now. I would say it's more like 40%, 30% perhaps. That is, the 40%, it's up from 29%. Now the question is, what do we do with this 4% if they're not going to go into Act 1? Well, the doctors said, you've only got 3 acts of illness there. Why don't you add a 4th act? And I said, well, the 4th act that I had thought of was the minister's role with funerals. And they said, no, there's a 4th act of medicine, of health care. The 4th act could deal with the chronically ill. And there's a new interest in chronic illnesses. The 4th act could deal with the whole area of gerontology. The 4th act could deal with the families going through losses related to the whole business of the I'm trying to think of the name of the new group that's developed hospice, the hospice programs, of course. So that you've got all kinds of things going here, and there is a new interest on the part of many young doctors in chronic illness and gerontology and family care and hospice care. And this will all be interrelated to Act 1. So they added 4% over here and 1% here. Now, as a clergyman, what am I suggesting that we ought to do about this situation if this is approximately what it's like? Well, first of all, there are a lot of people who have already been doing a lot of work in this field, in this area. And I'd like to mention the 4 groups that I think of offhand. The first are nurses. Nurses have long been interested in patient education and care. They've gone out of their way to do a teaching job for patients, particularly with cardiovascular problems, and doctors are using them all the time to teach patients. It takes a long time to teach patients how to do things like that. But nurses have long been interested in patient education, and I mean for the last 30, 40 years they've been interested in it. The second group are people in the social sciences. I'm thinking here of the people who are in psychology and in sociology, the social workers, and I'm also thinking of school teachers. And I'd like to just kind of write that in, school teachers, if I can get this to work. There we go. School teachers are in a position to pick up the earliest cries for help among their little kids who are going through problems of grief and loss, particularly where the child has lost a pet, for instance, or whose grandmother dies, or whose parents' marriage is dying. We've done some seminars with teachers in small towns where we've taken every teacher for a period of a day or 2 or 3 and worked with them in the field of grief and how to handle it because it's so prevalent in causing illnesses. And the teachers are very grateful because they find that they can deal with patients, with little children, at a time when they are most moldable and most open to that kind of help. And we need to make sure that school teachers are given that kind of training. The third group are clergy. Some people don't know that for the last 40 years now, clergy have been invited to spend 3 months or a whole year in teaching hospitals, in hospitals of chronic illnesses, in the whole area of social institutions, social work groups, in mental hospitals. Clergy have spent time walking the wards with the doctors and the nurses. About 100,000 clergy have now taken 3 months of training in this kind of work. And they're just beginning to get their feet on the ground to know how to relate to the physicians and nurses of our time. The fourth group, which I think is the most important group of all, are lay people. Lay people are showing great ability to work with people who are going through difficulties. There's a Stephen ministry group, for instance, that takes lay people for a 50-hour course on developing listening skills and trying to understand the dynamics that cause people to become ill. And I see the potential here of developing these 4 groups in ways that we have not yet done so, except for an experiment that I'd like to close with. The experiment is to say, under the concept of friends, this is what congregations ought to be. And we're developing what we call a congregational health partnership plan, in which churches and hospitals can begin to work together. But congregations are made up of people. We hope they're made up of friends who are willing to be friends to people who are going through difficult times. Congregations have pastors who are trying their best to deal with the problems that occur in their congregations. But one of the things that we think now has to be developed is the whole matter of how do you organize this in a congregation? How do you make the congregation more aware that it really is in the field of preventive medicine? If a pollster were to come to your community and knock on the doors of the various homes and ask questions like, what are the health agencies in this community? What would the answer be? Well, we tried this, and we found that the average person immediately thinks of a local hospital or 2, and then some maybe well-known medical clinic. And that's where it stops. In other words, these are our health agencies. Well, actually, health is more than just sickness. We're interested in health care as well as sickness care. But health care really takes place here. And we now feel that the health system of our day needs to have the additional help of people in congregations, because congregations represent the largest group of people in America. Maybe 2/3 of the people in America have some, at least tangential relationship to churches. So what we've done is to try out putting what we call parish nurses on the staffs of churches. These parish nurses are doing 4 things. First, they are health educators. They are spending time with people in the congregation in seminars, workshops, discussion groups, potluck supper groups, forums between services, and so on. They bring in other people to speak and also speak themselves. We have found, where we have tested this out in at least 100 churches now, that the people love this, and they feel that this is a part of understanding the total Christian life, because after all, Christ himself, spoken of often as the great physician, was not interested just in the souls of people unattached to bodies. He was interested in the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. So this is a natural part of the work of the church. The second thing that the nurse does is to be a personal health counselor. And we find that the line forms to the right, because on Sunday mornings, many of these nurses now that are in churches are inviting people to come for blood pressure checking. And in some churches, particularly the Catholic churches, where you have huge numbers of people, 10,000 members, for instance, the nurse will have 3 or 4 other nurses in the congregation who are helping her. I say her because we don't have any male nurses as yet. We are looking forward to that someday. And about every 10th person says, could I talk to the parish nurse sometime about